Hey guys, and welcome back to another video. For today's video, we are going to continue down the list of the 50 best horror movies that you've never seen, with number 31 for us, but number 33 on the list, Lemora, A Child's Tale of the Supernatural. Lemora, A Child's Tale of the Supernatural came out in 1973 and was directed by Richard Blackburn and written by Richard Blackburn and Robert Fern. For a quick synopsis of the movie, it takes place in the 1920s, focusing around a 13-year-old girl named Lila Lee, who is a devout Catholic and lives with the church. She gets a letter that her father, who is a gangster, is very ill, and although he did murder her mother, she wants to be able to forgive him before he passes away, so she runs away from the church at night in order to go after her father to forgive him. As she's making her way back to her hometown, people are telling her that it's really not a good idea for her to go back there. Strange things have been happening, and the people who do go into that town do not seem to come back. Lila is not fazed by this, and she still makes her way to the town, but on the bus ride over to town, the bus is attacked by a horde of creatures, which we find out later happens to be vampires. The bus Lila is on ends up crashing and she's knocked unconscious, and when she comes to, she finds herself locked in a small one-room cottage in the middle of a forest. An elderly hag-like lady named Solange comes in to give her some food, and Lila pushes her down and runs out of the cottage, going over to the house that she was able to see from the window. While hiding under the porch of this house, she can hear her father's voice coming from inside, so she knows that she's found her father. But before Lila can get in to find her father, she's confronted by Lemora, the woman who owns the home. Lemora tells Lila that she can't go see her father because he's got a very contagious and bad disease and she's not yet immune to it. And inside this house, Lemora just has kind of like a gaggle of children who are all like super sick and gross looking that are really interested in Lila, and Lemora is super interested in Lila. She's almost like grooming her, complimenting her, telling her things are going to be okay. She's trying to like soothe her. But Lila's also noticing strange things within the house. Like when she's holding the mirror, Lemora's reflection wasn't in the mirror, so she's starting to kind of catch on that things are a little bit odd here, and she's still not being allowed to see her father. And after getting bathed by Lemora, Lila is attacked by her father, who escapes from his room and turns out to be just as horribly disfigured and ugly as the vampires that we saw earlier. And he does end up attacking Lila, scratching her across the back, and as she's running through the house trying to escape, he ends up killing Solange, and then Lemora has to ward him off with fire. This is when Lila starts to catch on to what's going on in this home and comes to the conclusion, after seeing Lemora sucking the blood out of the child's neck, that she is a vampire. But as she's trying to escape, she's attacked by the forest creatures, which happen to be like the disfigured vampires that live in the forest, and the ones that are in the house with Lemora are like the non-disfigured vampires. So she's trying to escape, and she's running all through this town, the town that people were telling her no one comes back from, just to find out that the whole town is the vampire village, and there are the normal vampires, and then there's these like monsters, kind of ravenous vampires, and they're fighting each other, and she's kind of like in the middle of all of this, just trying to stay alive. And Lemora does end up finding her and catching her and bringing her back to the house. And as the fight's dying down, all the vampires appear to be dead. Lila's kind of walking through this room just for her father to come out and attack her, and she unfortunately does have to kill him with a stake through the heart. And as Lemora is comforting her, she pretty much just bites Lila's neck and turns her into a vampire. Lemora was kind of wanting Lila to be her companion for, everlasting, eternal life. And she does end up turning Lemora into a vampire, and whenever the Reverend, who has this entire time been looking for Lila because she, escaped the church, ends up finding her in this town, and as he's approaching her, she's pretending to be really excited to see him, and they had hinted at the fact that the Reverend was starting to get a sexual attraction to Lila as she was starting to develop and become a woman. So Lila, now a vampire, the Reverend doesn't know this, uses that against him by sort of seducing him and starts to kiss him, and he eventually gives in, just for her to swoop down and bite his neck as Lemora watches over happily. And the movie then ends with Lila back at the church singing in the church choir. So this movie came out in 1973, but wasn't actually seen widely in the US until closer to the 1990s. And that's because the Catholic League of Decency banned the movie in 1975 because they considered it to be anti-Catholic. And that's mainly because Lila belonged to the Catholic Church. She ran away and was a part of this vampiric thing. There's like lesbian undertones between her and Lemora, and then the Reverend kind of having that attraction to Lila, and Lemora was talking poorly on the Reverend and the church because, vampires don't like stuff like that. So the movie was pretty much banned in 1975 and wasn't really seen until the 90s. It had a small theatrical release in the US, but then pretty much was kind of forgotten about until recently when it's been put on DVD. And even though it's available on DVD, it's still like you have to order it online. It's not a easy movie to come by. It's not streaming on anything, and even the DVD sales themselves aren't that great. It's definitely considered a lost vampire movie. And the reason that it has sort of a cult following is because of Lemora, the female vampire in the film. She is super creepy and has sort of that Dracula presence to her while still being more on that feminine side. And we get some of that like good lesbian vampire love. With that being said, I'm not a fan of this movie. It's very confusing, and there isn't a lot of character development or really heavy dialogue, so you're left to kind of catch up and try to figure out what's going on as you're watching the movie. Like, the fact that there's two different versions of the vampires, personally, I thought it was like vampires versus werewolves at first, because the ravenous vampires, the makeup on them is so like overdone and bad. They look like they are more like wolf-like creatures. And the whole movie is shot with really low, dark lighting, so it's hard to tell when you've sort of changed scenes or in like a different room or a different area. So knowing that she had finally made it to her hometown was kind of difficult to determine, and then suddenly their bus is getting attacked by these like wolf-looking vampire creatures. And then she just ends up at this cottage at Lemora's house, and we just don't know really where she is or how long she's been there, what's going on. There's no explanations given in that sense. And Lila is a 13-year-old child who just saw these like mutinous, ravenous creatures attack a bus and kill the bus driver. And she just doesn't question anything Lemora does. She doesn't ask really any questions other than like 2 or 3 in the very beginning, and then she just sort of just goes with the flow after that. And because this isn't a very well-known movie, there really isn't a lot of information behind it. We do know Richard Blackburn and Robert Fern were inspired by the 1970 movie Count Yorga Vampire, and we do know that they had a little bit of other inspirations from older vampire horror movies as well. But that's kind of it for what I could find as far as like cool background information on this movie. There really just doesn't seem to be a lot about it, especially because the DVD release didn't happen until so many years later, like almost like 30-40 years after the movie came out. So there isn't really a lot of behind the scenes or special features, so there's not a lot of information just in general about the film, and like I said, it's even hard to find just to watch. And even with all of that, it still has sort of mixed reviews across the board. People seem to either love it or hate it. There's no real in-between, but the reviews themselves average out to about, on most platforms, it has around a 3 to 3.5 star rating. Some people say it's a classic lesbian vampire film, other people say it's too dark to understand what's going on and the dialogue is dry and delivered poorly. So I agree with both of those too, so I can understand why it's so mixed matched. An alternate title for this movie was also Lemora, the Lady Dracula. We're supposed to be watching the whole movie through the perspective of Lila, the 13-year-old girl, which is why the finished title was Lemora, A Child's Tale of the Supernatural. But that title itself doesn't make sense to me because it's not like Lila's narrating over the whole thing, and even at the end, she goes back to the church, but the movie just sort of ends there, so we don't know if she's like lived a prolonged life, if she went back to the church just to like attack people there. We don't really get any of that either. So I'm not sure who she's telling the story to, other than I guess us in that sense, but it doesn't feel like I'm witnessing something that's like a story being told to me. It feels like I'm just kind of thrown into this weird darkly lit home movie. And that's another thing people said about this as well. It's shot sort of like a home movie. It's very grainy and low resolution. Even the high resolution copies that you can get have a low resolution feel to them. And I know it was shot in the 70s, so you're shooting on film, so it's going to have a lower quality just feel to it overall. But this movie just was so low budget. Even after production, it still has a low quality feel to it. And the whole movie is shot with like blue lighting and blue filters over it. It's just blue the entire movie. So it's not only dark, but everything has also got a blue tint to it, which helps make it even darker. And this movie I saw sort of classified as fairy tale horror, which I can understand because it's almost like Lila is this super popular, beautiful, she's a great singer, she's super well loved at the church, and she finds herself in the hands of like a vampire. She's got a hag that works with her. I can understand that fairy tale aspect, but I wouldn't consider this a horror movie, to be honest with you. I don't feel like there's a good build-up in suspense. I don't feel like the story is told in a compelling way, and there really isn't any good scares, in my opinion. And I know that it's an older movie, so sometimes the jump scares or the intentional scares aren't as impactful now as they were back then. But I mean, even thinking back to if I had seen this when I was little, I would have been more bored than anything. The movie doesn't have enough compelling elements to draw you in, so when those scares happen, they really affect you. I did see a review, which I would agree with, that kind of says that this is a movie that if it was remade in modern times, it could be a lot better. Because it's not like it's a bad story, it's just not done well. But it's funny because even in the documentary, the 50 Best Horror Movies You've Never Seen, the only thing they really have to say about this movie is that it's a great lesbian vampire story. And that's really it. Nothing about the scariness or the actual horror elements, just like the cool vampire lesbian story. So that's why I feel like it could be a much better modern movie, because it just doesn't feel like it was done well enough for what the concept was. And as far as my gore rating for this movie, it's going to get a gorgeous rating just because the effects were just bad. The ravenous monstrous vampires, like I said, had more wolf-like features to them. The makeups were intense. They had prosthetics. They took their time on them, but they just weren't right for the movie. And whenever Lemora does suck the blood of one of the children, when she pulls back, it looks like just this thick, bright red streak of blood running down her chin. It's just super cheesy. And the gore, for a vampire movie, there isn't a lot of gore, and the gore they do show is just not good. And I'm already not huge into vampire movies. I like older vampire movies because they have that Count Dracula feel, but this one just sort of missed the mark for me. I'd love it if it was remade. I think it could be remade into something really cool, but as for the 1973 version, I'm not going to try to see this movie again. But it does have a cult following, and there are people who do love the movie, so if you like vampires, I suggest that you go watch this, add it to your repertoire of vampire movies, and let me know what you thought of it. I personally don't feel like this movie deserves a spot on the list, but I'd love to know what you guys think. You can leave a comment down below or head over to my Instagram, What a Horror. I'll be making a post about this video as well. But as always, I want to thank you guys so much for watching. Please like and subscribe if you want to see new videos, because I put out new videos every Friday. And until next time, stay spooky.